So I'm challenged to know which button to push.
Here. Quick little math tutorial for you.
Yes.
Forward, backward.
Okay, thank you. So the city of Fort Lauderdale has had many challenges, as has Southeast Florida in general, regarding adapting to sea level rise and extreme weather. And I know that Ben Strauss this morning gave you a tutorial on some sea level rise issues, and I'm going to take you through a very, very quick look at what are some of the extreme conditions that we're facing in the South Florida area. Locally, we're experiencing tidal flooding. That picture in the upper corner is actually one of our cultural resources. It's the Stranahan House. It's the first house that was built in the city of Fort Lauderdale. So it was built at grade, and it is threatened by this tidal flooding. We also have inland flooding issues, and I'll explain that to you a little bit more as we go through this presentation. In the bottom corner, you'll see that we had sand pushed up all along our coastal highway during the passage of a number of different tropical storms. This blocks our evacuation route from the barrier island. And then during Thanksgiving in 2012, we had erosion problems from Sandy that got exacerbated by a winter storm that pushed easterly winds, pushed a lot of wave action on Florida onto the shore, and it undermined about 2,000 feet of our coastal A1A highway, which resulted in one lane falling into the ocean. So that's our short-term challenges, but in the long range, we've got sea level rise issues that are even more compelling. Over the previous century, South Florida has experienced about 8 to 10 inches of sea level rise at the Key West tide gauge. But when we look forward, the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Change Compact has been providing certain technical tools to the local municipalities in the region to help with our climate change planning. And this is a very recently released sea level rise projection that we will be using for planning purposes going forward. And what you can see is that in the time frame between 1992 and 2030, our expectation is that we're going to see between 6 and 10 inches of sea level rise, which is equivalent to what we saw over the previous 100 years. By the year 2060, our expectation is to see between 14 and 26 inches of sea level rise. And then going forward, a great deal more. The area in the blue is the likely range of what is expected to be seen in terms of sea level rise. But that orange line, which shows much higher concerns, up to 81 inches of sea level rise at the turn of the century, is a possible scenario. And if you've been listening back and forth, you've been hearing these numbers batted around all day long. But again, we have this issue. Earlier they talked about nuisance flooding. This is also called blue sky flooding. And these are high tide events that we're currently experiencing on a regular basis. This is from the Union of Concerned Scientists Encroaching Tide publication. And the current expectation in South Florida is that we see about 10 of these high tide, extreme high tide events annually now. But by the year 2045, which in many ways is just around the corner, we're expecting over 240 of these events annually. So what about temperature? The expectation, this is from the Climate Central website. Ben Strauss had featured some of these types of tools this morning. The expectation for South Florida is that by the year 2100, we're going to look a whole lot more like Harlingen, Texas than we do like Fort Lauderdale today, seeing a shift of nearly 6 degrees of temperature over the course of that time frame. But we've been seeing these extreme weather events through the course of time. 2009, Hollywood got between 9 and 16 inches in a 24-hour period, flooded the coastal area of Hollywood. In January and March of 2010, our spring was about 4.5 degrees below average, which doesn't sound like a lot, but in South Florida, that's a big difference. We had an entire week that it stayed below 50 degrees in January of that year. Iguanas were literally falling out of the trees because it wasn't warm enough for them to maintain their grasp on the limbs. So a very real event for us. And then in March of 2011, we had what was an 80-year historic drought. Aspects of this drought were repeated this spring. So we're seeing these events at a higher frequency on a regular basis. If you look across the country at extreme precipitation events, What these graphics are showing you is that from 1900 up until the 2000s, that over time, the relative number of extreme events that we're experiencing is going up. And in the southeast United States, you can see that starting in the 1970s, we're experiencing more and more of these extreme events. And this absolutely translates to dollars over time. So one of those extreme events occurred in January of 2014, where 22 inches of rain fell in the Boynton Beach area in a 24-hour period. 12 of those inches fell within a 1-hour period, which is what's called a 1,000-year storm. A 1,000-year storm means that statistically, this type of a storm will happen only once in 1,000 years. But the frequency of these types of events are increasing over time across the country and across the world. And in this particular downpour, people lost their lives. They drove into the canals because they couldn't tell the difference between the street and the canal. And portions of roadways fell away. This actually closed down I-95, the major northwest corridor, north-south corridor for a 24-hour period, and it closed the schools. It's just rain. It was a lot of rain. So in the city, we've been trying to lay a foundation to become more climate prepared. And we engaged our residents in developing a vision for the city that went out through 2035. And that's our Fast Forward Fort Lauderdale vision plan. And part of that plan is a statement that we will be a resilient city. We are ready is the statement. We want to be a resilient and sustainable city. And that was translated from a vision to our strategic plan. So over the course of 5 years, the strategic plan goes out to 2018. There's a whole series of initiatives that address climate issues as well as the other aspects of the vision that were embraced by our community. These ideas came from them, and certainly issues like what happened on A1A brought that awareness to our community so that they included this as part of their vision. So the vision statement that we are ready encompasses this intent of adapting for our future. As I mentioned, in the fall of 2012, Tropical Storm Sandy created this collapse of A1A. So we had to get everything cleaned up, and we had to either put back what was there, or as I like to call it, we needed to respond with resilience. And so these sheet pilings were put in all along the portion of the roadway that collapsed to make sure that the waves couldn't undermine the road in the future. And you'll notice the sheet pilings. So in the next graphic, one of the things we did when we redesigned the road after this emergency repair was to change the way that the road tilted. Previously, the road tilted toward the ocean, and that was to help manage rainfall. Now the road tilts toward the properties, and it pushes any stormwater out to the intercoastal on the other side of the barrier island. By doing that, we ended up raising the road 2 feet, which gives us 2 feet more of run-up for those waves. So 2 feet of resiliency against those waves. In addition to that, we had a decorative knee wall where you could walk along this promenade and you could sit on the knee wall or you could look out on the ocean. And that collapsed along with everything else when the event happened. Well, now the knee wall is actually anchored into the sheet piling. So not only is the roadway 2 feet higher, but we've added another 2 to 3 feet with this knee wall to break the waves as they potentially come over. So if you look at this today, it just looks pretty much like it looked before. It's a pretty nice coastal highway, a pretty walkway, a little knee wall. But what you're really seeing is adaptation infrastructure in place. So we have a lot of coastal flooding from tides, this nuisance flooding that we were talking about, and I'm not sure how many of you really understand how this works. Our drainage and our drainage infrastructure is tied to these tidal water bodies. And so when the rain falls, it falls on the roadway, it falls on the yards, it goes down this storm drain that you see in the streets, and then it goes into magic infrastructure underground that no one knows is there, which is all these pipes. And these pipes will lead to some type of water body where the water is discharged. But what happens in a situation where you have an extreme high tide or you have sea level rise is that water covers the end of the pipe that you're trying to use to discharge things through, and it runs up that infrastructure in reverse. And it comes up through the grate and it floods the roadways. Now, what happens if it rains when this is going on? That fresh water, that rainwater, has nowhere to go. And so not only do you have this flooding that's being caused right at the coastline because of this rain event, but even in areas much further inland, they can't discharge rainwater, and so you get this freshwater flooding during high tide inland if there's a rain event. So one of the ways that the city has been trying to become more resilient is that we've installed tidal valves. These are one-way valves that only let the water go out. They don't let the water come in. And that's helped a lot in many of these coastal areas. But adaptation is a constant activity. And so one of the things that has happened is that under average tidal conditions, you have a dry street. And what you see below is a tide cycle. The blue is the predicted tide, the green is the observed tide. So under average tidal conditions, we can keep the street dry. And for those areas where we've had challenges because those areas are low-lying, we've installed these one-way tidal valves, and that gives us some additional range in the tide in order to keep that street dry. But you'll hit a point where the water goes above whatever that magic value is, magic elevation. And in the case of this October high tide, the water exceeded not only where the storm drains were, but it came up and over the seawall. So the tidal valves were working exactly as designed, but the water just found another way to get on the road, and it came up over the seawalls. And so even though we've adapted to a certain level of dealing with this tidal issue, now we have to look at that next stage. What's that next line of defense? So one of the ways that you do that is you can change your regulations regarding your seawalls. So currently, what you can see is under average high tide conditions, low tide conditions, it hits a certain height on the average seawall. But what has happened is that if you add that 1 foot of extreme high tide, and then you add a 2-foot sea level rise on top of it, then where do you get in terms of how high should your seawalls be? So you're planning for the length of time that seawall is going to exist, somewhere between 30 and 50 years for that piece of infrastructure. And at this point, our current ordinance allows for you to plan for a maximum, but it doesn't give you a minimum that you have to go to. But what happened with this recent high tide was that we went way over the expected height for the extreme high tide. We went up to this additional king tide in September, which has made us completely change the way that we are thinking about how to change this ordinance. We went from thinking we were in pretty good shape to deal with a 2-foot sea level rise to saying maybe we're not, because we're having an extreme condition that is happening at a higher frequency. But you have to remember that when you start making these changes in a built environment, not everybody makes those changes at the same time, and you end up with conditions like this where one neighbor has the old seawall and the new neighbor has the new fancy schmancy higher seawall, and you create these discontinuities in your environment. And so that becomes a challenge for your community. How do you regulate it in a way that you do not create this patchwork of different regulations? And it's one of the hugest challenges for any municipality as you change your development requirements. So one of the things that we're doing in the city of Fort Lauderdale is that we've developed a 10-year master plan. We're looking at every tool in our toolbox to deal with tidal flooding, to improve our ability to deal with extreme rainfall, including tidal valves, bioswales, pervious pavement, even pump stations. But the cost is about somewhere between $500 million and $1 billion over the course of 10 years to provide this additional level of protection. And with all adaptation, it comes down to what can you pay for, what can you afford. One of the other things we're doing from a policy standpoint is that we have designated what are called adaptation action areas in our comprehensive plan. We have policies that allow us to do this. And the whole idea is that if we designate these are areas that we recognize are vulnerable to coastal flooding. and we will prioritize funding for those locations to protect the infrastructure that is there at this time. It is the city's commitment to protect the infrastructure and the properties that are in those areas to the extent that we are able to. And by doing so, we're telling the community we're investing in your risk reduction over time. So the example here is this, the Riverwalk District. The map shows the boundaries of where the adaptation action area is, and then those little dots tell you specifically what projects are slated for that area in order to improve the condition, reduce the vulnerability, reduce the risk. And so with that, ooh, listen, I stopped right on time.